Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the work I will present today is a part of the PhD thesis of Tomoki Shinko. And these are my co-workers, and the work is about the effect of hydrogen on fatigue crack growth in a commercially pure iron under high pressure of gaseous hydrogen. So this is a brief outline of my talk. After a short introduction, I will give you some experimental details, and then I will present the effect of hydrogen on the fatigue crack growth rates, and then I will move to a section devoted to the observation of the fracture surfaces and also the deformation substructure beneath the fracture surface. And finally, I will try to summarize my talk. So as regards the background of this study, we initiated this type of experiments a couple of years ago within the framework of a so-called hydrogen-based economy, where you need to have some information about the hydrogen compatibility of the materials used for infrastructures of transport and storage of gaseous hydrogen. And so this issue is all the more complex if you have to take into account the presence of a crack-like defect submitted in a structure submitted to cyclic loading, because it is well known that the presence of hydrogen in the surrounding environment can be a source of fatigue crack growth enhancement. As more particularly concerns the motivation of the work that I will present today, the point is that a couple of years ago we developed a model based on cohesive zone models coupled with diffusion equations in order to try to predict the fatigue crack growth enhancement observed under high pressure of gaseous hydrogen in magnetotic steels. And the point is that we were unable to reproduce the tremendous fatigue crack growth enhancement that we experimentally observed. And the conclusion was, one of the conclusions was to say that in this model we do not introduce any effect of hydrogen on the local plasticity at the crack tip. And the reason is that we have, at that time, we had no information about this. And for the similar reasons as exposed this morning by Antonio Alvaro, in order to get further insights about these effects of hydrogen on crack tip plasticity, we decided to consider simple material, mainly a ferritic microstructure, and for that we selected a commercially pure iron. So this is the composition of the material we used. We applied a heat treatment to the sheet, and this is the corresponding microstructure. So we have some, we still have, after heat treatment, the presence of some isolated dislocations and a few pileups. The average grain size is 90 microns, and the yield strength of the material is 170 megapascal. The fatigue crack growth experiments were performed with what we call the HycoMat test rig, which is actually constituted of the load frame and of a pressure vessel. So typically the fatigue sample is placed in this small chamber within the pressure vessel, and we introduced the hydrogen gas in this chamber. And perhaps what is important to note is that this load frame is equipped with an internal load cell in order to compensate the effect of pressure. The experiments that I will present today have been performed on CT specimens with these dimensions. The crack length monitoring is performed by a potential drop technique, and we also perform some crack closure measurements, but I will not discuss that this morning. today, sorry. In order to get further insights about the role of hydrogen on crack tip plasticity, we, by fib milling, we extracted some TM foils from selected areas of the fracture surfaces. So let me move now to the fatigue crack growth results. So here, for the sake of clarity, I will only present the results obtained at a hydrogen pressure of 35 megapascals with different loading frequencies. So first, here you have the fatigue crack growth response of the material in vacuum. This curve is the curve obtained under high pressure of nitrogen using the same test rig. And here, the fatigue crack growth rates measured in air. And the red points correspond to the fatigue crack growth data obtained at under high pressure of hydrogen. And what you can notice is that beyond a certain value of the stress intensity factor range, we have a significant fatigue crack growth rate enhancement in this transient regime. And here we have a kind of steady state regime, which is dependent on the applied frequency. So the fatigue crack growth enhancement is already significant at 20 Hertz. When you reduce the frequency to 2 Hertz, this enhancement is larger. And if you reduce further the frequency, you still have a small effect, but it seems that we have a kind of saturation of the frequency effect. And so typically, this was not observed, such a saturation was not observed in a matencytic theorem. So this is another representation of this frequency effect for a selected value of the stress intensity factor range of 20 megapascal square meter. And you can see this fatigue crack growth enhancement and the saturation when you increase the cycle period. We also performed additional experiments by making the pressure vary and also the frequency. So the results are summarized in this graph. So basically, the pressure will influence the transition regime. If you increase the pressure, the transition is observed at lower value of delta key. And for a given pressure, if you lower the frequency, you increase the fatigue crack growth rate in the highly accelerated regime. But nevertheless, in all cases, you have this three regime. Regime A, where we have no fatigue crack growth enhancement, a transition regime, and then a highly accelerated regime. So in first analysis, these three regimes can be analyzed according to the hydrogen concentration gradient ahead of the crack tip. So here you have a representation of hydrogen concentration at the crack tip using diffusivity coefficient value that has been measured on the undeformed material. And the point is that in a non-accelerated regime, you can consider that the crack tip always ingresses into a material which is saturated with hydrogen. And the transition would occur when the crack tip can see the beginning of a concentration gradient ahead of the crack tip. And the highly accelerated regime would correspond with the presence of a pronounced gradient for a given pressure. And by this means, you can also understand the influence of frequency to some extent. Now, if we look at the cracking mode, what is really surprising in this material is that Uh, Here you have two observations at different frequencies. This is the fracture surface produced by the pre-cracking in air. And you can see that as soon as we introduce the hydrogen gas within the pressure vessel, we have a drastic change in the fracture mode from a fully transgranular towards a fully intergranular cracking mode. And if we look at higher magnifications on these intergranular facets, we can notice the presence of some kind of stripes with only one system of stripe for a given facet. And the stripes are more or less perpendicular to the crack growth direction. So this is a higher magnification view of these stripes, and you can see that on the given facet, you have more or less a constant spacing. In that case, it could be 0.5 micron. So Tomoki performed a series of measurements of these spacings on fracture surfaces produced under different exposure conditions, different hydrogen pressure, different frequencies. So here you have the results. So you can see that, of course, for certain exposure condition, we have a scatter which is more or less pronounced, but the scale is not very large here. But if you consider the average value of these spacings, we can consider that they are more or less independent of the exposure condition. If we now look at the deformation substructure beneath the fracture surface, so here we compare the deformation substructure for a given value of the stress intensity factor range in air and in hydrogen gas. And the point is that in both cases, we observe a typical cell structure, which is actually similar to the cell structure that we observed when we perform low cycle fatigue testing on the same material. And at this stage, it's difficult to see if there is some influence of hydrogen on the size of the cell structure. And but the point is that we are unable to relate this deformation substructure to the stripes, the markings observed on the intergranular facets. And from these observations also, it's not evident to say if we have mechanisms of plasticity mediated intergranular failure as introduced by Wang and co-workers for intergranular fracture in pure iron. If we now look at the fracture surfaces produced in a highly accelerated regime, the point is that the fracture surface looks more brittle, and we notice the presence of coarse striations on these cleavage-like facets. And the main difference with the markings that we observed on the intergranular facets is that in that case, we're able to relate the spacing of these striations with the macroscopic crack growth rate. So these are really striations. Because I missed that point, but the markings, the spacing on intergranular markings is much larger than the growth rate in that case. And so we performed the same type of observation of the deformation substructure. So in air, once again, we have this cell structure. And in hydrogen, in that case, we have a deformation substructure which is not organized in the form of cells. We have some isolated dislocation tangles with the presence of some long lines of dislocations. And in some cases, you can see Tomoki was able to identify the tip of the striations from the fracture surface. So for instance, here you have the tip of a striation and the dislocation line emanating from this type. And maybe it's not clear on the screen, but we also noticed the presence of voids on some dislocation lines. So let me summarize my talk. Sorry. So we have seen that we have a fatigue crack growth enhancement in this commercial pure iron with a dependency on gas pressure and frequency, with the presence of three characteristic regimes. A first regime where we have no fatigue crack growth enhancement despite this change from a transgranular to a fully intergranular cracking mode, a transient regime, and a highly saturated regime characterized by the presence of coarse brittle striations. And maybe this change, this different regime might be controlled by the concentration gradient at the crack tip. So we're still working on this. I do not have time to detail. And I would like to finish by some acknowledgements and by thanking you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Find any definitive change in mechanism, or is it just kinetics that's governed by the elevated pressures? I mean, is there anything mechanistically different about high pressure hydrogen in these materials?
But, well, actually what is puzzling for me is that typically on this pure iron, it seems that we have a change in mechanisms, at least on failure mechanisms, in cases where we have no effect on kinetics, while in a case where we have a significant fatigue crack growth enhancement, the cracking mode is not so much different.
But intergranular facets on relatively low strength materials is seen in fatigue in a lot of different cases, and it's got nothing to do with brittle fracture. It's not a brittle like a hydrogen fracture would be in an overload. It's not an uncommon mode.
But the point is that in any other condition, in vacuum, air, or nitrogen, we never observe a single intergranular facet in this material.
But it's often seen at relatively low growth rates in fatigue. It's not a brittle mode necessarily.
Yes, but I didn't say that it was a brittle mode.
Is that related to pressure, though? I mean, is that intergranular mode?
I have no explanation for that.
That was my question. Does hydrogen pressure, change mechanisms at all? When you compare a low pressure hydrogen fatigue or overload fracture with a 100 megapascal type pressure?
That's a good question, but I have no definitive answer about this. But actually, maybe I was not clear during my presentation, but the point is that this intergranular fracture in the case of pure iron doesn't look brittle at all. I agree with you. It's the grains are highly deformed when you look, or at least they look highly deformed.
If I may add one comment to Professor Rich's question. We did test fatigue test inside SC and environmental SEM with pressures in the range of 90 Pascal, 80 Pascal, very low pressure. But we see very similar. So I don't think that the pressure is playing a very crucial role here. Because as soon as you have this free surface of metal exposed to a little bit of hydrogen gas, it's going to be absorbed on the surface and going to do whatever its hydrogen is doing at the fracture process zone. So, but in the macroscopy, what we did was a very small scale testing and a very well-defined single crystal samples. So here, I think what's happening, because we are also doing on macroscopic samples, but in situ electrochemical charged one, I think that the condition that you have in the thickness of the crack, you have different orientation, so the K value that you're measuring is not really comparable with the local K values that you have at the place where the hydrogen starts to work or do the hydrogen embrittlement. It's a little bit different. So when you're increasing the pressure, maybe you have a better cover rate or things. But to be honest, I don't really think that the pressure of the hydrogen in the BCC metals plays a very crucial role.
That was my conclusion from all this. The mechanism, but the kinetics clearly have changed some.
Yeah, but the mechanism, I don't think, because the kinetic inside metal is not the bottleneck.
Right.
It's so fast that everything